I want to introduce Sheila Willis. She's joining us today out of Columbia, South Carolina. Sheila is a partner at Fisher Phillips. She's also a contributing author to our South Carolina employment law manual. That's our South Carolina state-specific HR guide. So I'm going to turn it over to Sheila. Sheila, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here. I hope everyone is having a great day. I'm excited to be with you guys talking about an employer's guide to using pronouns and LGBTQ plus terminology in the workplace. As Amy said, I am a partner with the law firm of Fisher Phillips. I sit in our Columbia, South Carolina office, but we have 38 offices across the country. My area of focus really looks at DE&I initiatives, wage and hour compliance, affirmative action, lots of employment, discrimination, and best practices. So I'm really excited to be with you all today to talk about this. As Amy said, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the box. I'll try and answer them as we're going through, but I have like 3 different screens going right now, so I may I may miss it. The other thing, the webinar is being recorded, but we won't be sharing the slides. And one of the reasons that I won't be doing that is because this is an area where the terminology and language and some of the legal opinions or the legal citations that I have in here are really changing very rapidly. And so I'd hate for you to have access to information that may not be accurate when you receive it. The presentation is accurate as of today, which is March 9th, 2023. So I wanted to give that kind of caveat and whatnot before we dive in. So the first question, why are we here? What is the purpose of having a discussion like this? And I first want to commend you for joining this webinar. A lot of times when we're talking about DE&I initiatives and DE&I concepts, a lot of times people, I always say your diversity journey is on a spectrum, right? And there are aspects of diversity that people can generally wrap their minds around, right? So they might be completely fine with understanding issues with men and women in the workplace, or they might be completely fine with looking at different race and ethnicities. But sometimes there are aspects that are a little bit stickier and a little bit harder for people to wrap their minds around. LGBTQ plus issues tend to be one of those that I've seen in my practice. And so I commend each of you guys for joining this webinar, for really wanting to get some additional information and insight on how to approach these issues. Maybe it's a refresher for you, but really the goal here is to avoid those situations where your comments or conduct make your coworkers or subordinates uncomfortable. It's to better equip you to supervise and retain your employees in a productive workforce, and to improve diversity, equity, inclusions in work environments. Now, I'm an employment lawyer. I represent businesses. So I will tell you that part of the other reason I'm doing this presentation is I want to make sure that you are doing things lawfully and legally compliant. That is something that is really important for me with my clients, is making sure the training and development piece really gets them to where they are in a situation where they're not having situations that are problematic or lead to litigation. So let's talk about some statistics here. The adult LGBTQ population is about 9 million in the US approximately. And these numbers are from 2013. And so they're, of course, probably updated. There are about 5.4 million workers in the US that identify as LGBTQ+. And those numbers are only greatly increasing with millennials and Gen Z entering the workforce. And a lot of times people are seeing that these numbers are increasing. I think that the representation of LGBTQ plus individuals in the workforce has always been there, but with the advent of millennials and Gen Z entering the workforce, there is a stronger appetite for discussing these topics and other topics that might lend themselves to identifying differently lived life experiences that employees have in the workplace, especially with millennials and Gen Gen Zs entering the workforce. Now, I will tell you that using this topic or discussing this topic as it relates to LGBTQ plus is a little bit of, I won't say a misnomer, but it definitely falls under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, but it's not something that has to be unique just to the LGBTQ plus population. And when we think about the LGBTQ plus population, I always find it a little strange when we're talking about that population, because there are so many variations of what goes into that. And I think that also leads to a level of confusion when we're talking about terminology and we're talking about different things, because oftentimes people associate different aspects with different letters, right? So when we're talking about the LG and the B, we're talking about a sexual orientation, we're talking about a sexual preference. We're talking about transgender or the T in that regard. And we're going to go over some of these. So if you missed that, we're going to go over these some again, but in the transgender context, we're talking about a sexual identity, your gender identity, how you feel within you. And that does not necessarily correlate to how you feel about someone sexually or romantically. And then when we think about the Q and the plus and the IA, and we'll talk some more about those definitions, that really looks at different ways that you may view yourself or you view the world in terms of the sexual or romantic interaction that you want to have with other individuals in the world. And so when you lump all that together, it can lead to some confusion because, again, we're talking about a variety of different concepts, but kind of lumping them all together as one. When you think about something like race or gender, right? We're talking about an easily identifiable, I say easily, not always, but a generally easily identifiable characteristic or standard. But LGBT is going to have a lot of different elements to it. So the first thing I want to do, sorry, I had to turn down the heater in my office. The first thing that we want to do is start with a mild grammar lesson. What is a pronoun? And that is helpful to know here because that will give us some context and framework here, right? A pronoun, that is a word used to refer either to the people who are talking or to a person in the third person. So I or you, she, her, he, him, they, them, right? So that's what we're looking at in pronouns. But why do they matter? Imagine how many times today someone has used your name or referred to you as a pronoun or referred to you by a pronoun, right? When you think about all the times in a day where someone calls your name or refers to you with a pronoun, whether it's she is doing a webinar, right? Someone just knocked on my door before we started. Someone outside said, oh, she's doing a webinar right now, right? Or where is Sheila? All of those concepts, right? That's a part of our language. That's a part of our identity. And that's a part of how people describe us individually. I am in the South right now. A lot of times using something that's gendered like sir and ma'am is a sign of respect in society. Using other things like gentleman or lady, those concepts are things that from a societal standpoint, we have grown to understand or been groomed to understand that those are signs of respect. That is how you address people. Mr., Mrs. My mom always says, like when I talk to people, I have to have a handle on their name. And what she meant was when I was meeting adults growing up, I was not calling her friend Cheryl. I was saying Miss Cheryl. I was not calling, the person at the school Bob. I was saying Mr. whatever Bob's last name happened to be, right? So thinking about what we have been ingrained as a society as those types of signs and respect, that really kind of helps you see why pronouns matter. Also, when we think about what does it mean to call someone by the wrong name or to not use language that is a sign of respect, right? Like what if, and I can't see folks there, but I see this attendee list. So I'm going to pick on someone just randomly. So Debbie Hughes, I see Debbie Hughes's name. Debbie, I am sure that you are a wonderful person, but what if I decided I didn't like how you spelled your name, right? If I decided that I was going to say that Debbie needs to have 2 B's, or if I decided that once I saw you that, hey, Debbie was really hard for me to understand. I don't get it. I'm calling you Kathy. You look like a Kathy to me. That's what we're going to do. I can see Amy's screen here. I can see her picture. And what if I looked at Amy and I said, Amy looks more like a Stacy. Stacy, could you come back on for a moment? Stacy, thank you for introducing me. I really appreciate it. Right? Do those things sound respectful? Right? Because my personal feelings and belief about what Amy should look like, the way Debbie should spell her name, are those respectful? Are those treating someone with dignity? Likely not. So when you think about this concept of pronouns, think about a core thought of treating people with dignity and respect and how you would want to be treated, right? You want people to understand who you are, how you spell your name, the name that you've been given by your parents or the name that you happen to go by. You might have a nickname. Perhaps your name is William and you go by Bill, and you get really annoyed when people insist on calling you William because you prefer Bill, right? When you think about pronouns and referring to people by their pronouns, I really want you to take it down to that level and not get bogged down on the gender implications of it, because I think that's where people get lost. But if you think about this just as a very basic, treating people with dignity and respect, treating people in a way that you would like to be treated. Is your name actually Jeffrey, but you prefer to be Jeff? I see that in the someone in the names. Is your name Kenneth, but you prefer to be named Ken? Is your name Kimberly and you actually like Kimberly, but you don't like Kim? You want to be called Kimberly, right? All of those things. Matthew, are you Matt? Are you Matt with 1 T, 2 T's? What's that preference that you have that you would want people to utilize to show you a level of dignity and respect when you are engaging with them? And so again, using these correct pronouns is so critically important. Again, as a first step, it is a sign of respect. When you are in your workforce, as a very basic level, if you approach all of these topics, whether it's your DE&I, your equal employment opportunity, your employee relations issues, if you treat everything from a place of coming with dignity and respect, you are going to do so much for your workforce and so much for your employees and the morale there. So using correct pronouns is important because it's a sign of respect. It's also inclusive. It's letting people know that you are open and available there. So for example, my name is Sheila Willis. My pronouns are she and her, right? So if anyone wants to share what their pronouns are, they are. It's an inclusive environment. It also takes away assumptions. A lot of, and we're going to talk about in a moment about why pronouns are difficult, but a lot of times you have assumptions about what a person should be based on how you have viewed them. And so when someone volunteers their pronouns for you, you don't have to assume, right? There's an old phrase that they used to say, what happens when you assume? You make a blank out of you and me, right? So if we take out that ability to assume and we just call people by what they would like to be referred to, it's going to be helpful. And additionally, if you are not someone in this space or someone that has a different pronoun than what you may present to the world, and that's where this comes in, right? It shows a sign of allyship, right? You are showing that you are an ally to this particular cause. But why is it difficult? This is generally not a way that people are used to communicating. When we talk about especially using they and them as pronouns, a lot of people talk about the grammar inconsistencies. They may say things like, they wanted to go to the store. And that is referring to maybe a singular person. So I have had friends who are very, very big into grammar and they just can't wrap their hand around it. They're like, I want to be inclusive, I'm happy, but using they to describe a singular person does not make sense. It is built into the core of our language. I don't understand how that makes sense, right? But we can expand around that. We can expand around that to be to make sure that we are respecting people's pronouns. A lot of it stems from people's personal beliefs. This is a very, very charged topic. This is a very strong topic, and a lot of it relates to how people see the LGBT group as a whole, right? So a lot of times people ascribe pronouns just to individuals that are transgender. And yes, that is something that happens when someone transitions from one gender to another. Their pronouns are going to change, but there are plenty of people who may want to use a pronoun difference that looks different than the way they're presenting, that have no interest in being transgender, have no interest in transitioning their gender on an outward looking basis. They just want to maintain a different type of identity in terms of their pronoun. The other thing that's really difficult here is it's hard to challenge our internal biases. A lot of this requires you to do work on yourself. And we're going to talk about that as we go through the presentation more, but it really requires you to do an internal challenge of your own biases. And sometimes it's internal challenge of biases from those around you. And another reason why this is difficult is it doesn't always reconcile the way that we see a person. Now, on this slide, you will see this is an actress named Sarah Ramirez. I was first introduced to them at the top. At that point, Sarah Ramirez was playing a character on Grey's Anatomy called Dr. Calliope Torres. She had several years on the show. She portrayed, once we eventually found out, and I'm hoping I'm not spoiling anything for anyone, but she started out as a bisexual woman. Actually, I think she was portrayed as a bisexual woman the entire stint that she had on Grey's, but did end up having a marriage with a woman on the show. Now, after Sarah Ramirez left Grey's, they began presenting themselves in the lower picture. You might recognize Sarah Ramirez with the shorter haircut in such TV shows as Madam Secretary. Most recently was a very controversial character on And Just Like That, which was the Sex and the City reboot as Che in that. Now, I have watched all of these shows. I have watched Sarah Ramirez in each of these contexts. And so when I was watching her as Calliope Torres, and I said her there, when I was watching them as Calliope Torres, I thought in my head, this is someone that is a she, her. That is how they are presenting, feminine presenting. What we learned is that Sarah Ramirez prefers a they, them. Sarah Ramirez says that they feel like there are masculine aspects of them and there are feminine aspects of them. Sarah Ramirez is not transgender, to my knowledge. Sarah Ramirez has not indicated any desire to transition into being someone of a different gender. Sarah Ramirez just prefers that their pronouns be they, them when you refer to them. Now, you may have noticed when I was speaking about them, occasionally I had a slip and I said her versus they, them, right? It's really difficult, and that's part of it's difficult when you see a person as one way and you suddenly have to change that perception, right? That's okay, because we can do hard things. So my goal in having that discussion, even as much as I have practiced and talked about this, I accidentally slipped into a her versus a they, them, but I did my best to correct it and to move forward and to be thoughtful about my word choice, right? It may be inconvenient for me in my initial thoughts of formulating this, but ultimately it's a sign of dignity and respect. It is very similar to if I just decided to start calling her Brittany, right? I've decided that you are her and your name is Brittany, right? And if that is someone that's my employee, what is that showing to them? How do they feel? How are they feeling included in that environment when I take it upon myself to decide for them what their name is and what they look like? But again, that is something that is critically difficult sometimes. How do we reconcile how we see a person, how we've known them, or what our internal biases have told us someone should look like, right? We have a perception of what women should look like. We have a perception of what men should look like. If we want to get down to the nitty gritty in places we don't like to talk about, we may have internal perceptions and biases about what we think trans individuals would look like, what we think lesbians should look like. And trying to make a pronoun fit those is not the best thing to do. Again, let people share their pronouns, but it can be difficult. So I shared this example of Sarah Ramirez as kind of a pop culture reference, because I kind of like to draw things in that regard, but it really does hammer home the point of it may not necessarily reconcile the way that you see a person. So let's talk about some pronoun examples. You know, you might have she, her, herself, he, him, hisself, they, them, themselves. You might have they, zer, zerself. There's a myriad of different pronouns that are out there and that changes. And sometimes people have multiple pronouns. So when Sarah Ramirez initially quote unquote came out with regard to pronouns, the initial kind of discussion was that she was she, them. That was the preferred pronouns that were there. Since that time, it has evolved into just wanting to be they, them. But pronouns do not necessarily have to be static or fixed in some regards. And again, I think that leads to some confusion with some folks, is that they are static or fixed, and at times they can be movable, whether that person is a transgender individual or that person becomes more evolved or aware in their own internal feelings. Another misconception, and I talked about this, was that pronouns only relate to transgender individuals. Pronouns are not always gender or sex related. And again, not necessarily transgender individuals only. You know, as I am here today, I present, in my impression, I present as a female, but if I told you that my pronouns were he, him, right? I am presenting in a way that you might perceive as a female, but my pronouns may be different. That does not necessarily mean that I would be a transgender individual. And the reason that we get here, and the reason why there continues to be issues, is in our society, we have had evolving definitions of what sex means. We have, from our social, societal definitions of sex, the legal nerd in me, those of you guys who are familiar with HR and workplace law, understand that there have been an evolution of a court's definition of sex. The EEOC, that's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, they have their own definitions of sex, statutory and court definitions, and then your own personal beliefs about sex. So one of the first iterations and looking at this concept of sex was a U.S. case called Price Waterhouse v. Hopkins. And this case was in 1989. And I mention it because it really is going to bring us full circle with some of the LGBT cases that we have been talking about, or the ones that have been come up recently. But in Price Waterhouse, the plaintiff there was an individual that was a female, and she wanted to advance in the company and was denied a promotion. And she sued for sex discrimination. And some of the comments that were made about her were that she was too manly, that she was too aggressive, that she acted like a witch with a B instead of a W. All of these concepts about her not being essentially feminine enough to be a woman in the workplace. And the court found that could be sex discrimination. Making a decision about someone's ability to conform or not conform to a particular sex is what can be an aspect of sex discrimination, right? It's not just sexual harassment. Now we look at Price Waterhouse, and Price Waterhouse has really been the foundation for providing LGBTQ rights in the workplace and in recent court decisions, right? Because the court said at the time that you should not, and when an employer makes a decision about someone based on their conformity or non-conformity with a particular sex, that's sex discrimination. I expect that you are going to act this way, or that you should be this way because of the gender that you present. That's exactly kind of to the heart of what we're talking about from a pronoun perspective. We look at someone and we expect that based on the way that they present themselves, that we should be able to identify them, that we should be able to use a particular pronoun. And what I'm telling you and what I'm encouraging you to do is that you should look beyond just what you see in front of you and speak to people and find out what their pronouns are. So let's go through some of the definitions that you might see in the LGBTQ plus space. So sex, right? This evolving definition. Currently, sex is a biological sex assigned at birth. That is a male or female. That is what is assigned at birth. Now, gender expression, this is how a person's sexual identity is displayed as a social or cultural construct. This is evidenced by their behavior and mode of dress, right? We might say that someone expresses the gender of female by wearing a skirt or by wearing those items that are socially or culturally understood to be applicable to one sex or the other. And gender identity, that's someone's own gender identification, and it can be the same or different from the person's biological sex, right? So a person might be born a female, meaning they have the biological female parts, but might have a gender identity as a male. They may identify more from a male perspective. A transgender individual is someone who lives or wishes to begin living in a gender role that is associated with a different sex from which they were born. So they may be born a female and then would like to transition into a male. So that would be changing their sex. Now, that does not necessarily impact their sexual orientation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And transition, when we're talking about that word in this context, we're talking about that process of changing someone's biological sex, and it's a gradual process. It does not automatically mean that someone is having a surgery to reassign what their genitals are. It is called a transition for a particular reason. People are on a variety of spectrums and have different feelings about where they are in the process. Now, your sexual orientation, that is the status of being straight, gay, asexual, or bisexual, how you feel romantically, how you would like to engage from a sexual and romantic perspective there. Gender identity discrimination, that's pretty much what I was talking about with Price Waterhouse, and what's kind of the consistent law right now is treating someone differently based on the fact that they identify with a gender that wasn't necessarily the one that was assigned at birth. There's some other ones that I just wanted to touch base and introduce you all to. Agender, that's individuals who find that they have no inner sense of their gender identity. That may be someone who has pronouns that are they, them, or they might pick some other type of pronoun there. Someone that is an androgynon, or you might have androgynous as someone that is a mix of male or female or in between. I remember back when the show Orange is the New Black was coming out, there was an actress there named Ruby Rose, and Ruby Rose presents as a very androgynous presentation, and there was a lot of discussion about that. Of whether the present of Ruby Rose felt more feminine or male in that regard. Bigender, those are people who often change between genders or both at once. Gender fluid, those are people that feel like they have different gender identities at different times. If I'm not mistaken, gender fluid is what Sarah Ramirez considers themselves. And so when they talk about being gender fluid, again, remember I told you that initial announcement was that they were her, they, or her, them, and is now, I think, settled really into that them, they, them status. Let's talk a little bit about the legal landscape. This was really in 2020, besides the fact that we were in a gripping global pandemic, there was a huge watershed case in this regard called Bostock v. Clayton County. Now, Bostock was actually 3 cases that were consolidated together. The other 2 were Altitude Express v. Zarda, and RG and JR Harris Funeral Homes versus the EEOC. In Zarda and Bostock, those were situations where gay men were fired because of their sexual orientation. And in the Harris Funeral Homes case, that was a case where a transgender woman was fired because of her gender identity. In that instance, the funeral parlor kind of owner, main person that greeted the individuals decided to begin transitioning and lost their job. Now, the court addressed for the first time whether an employer can fire somebody simply for being homosexual or transgender. Now, this was really, really interesting because if you have been in the human resource space or have been dealing with work in general, from an anti-discrimination standpoint, the most workforces were using this very expansive definition of sex discrimination, gender identity. And in fact, federal contractors expressly included gender identity in their interpretation of their equal employment opportunity clauses. And in fact, the EEOC said that they would be enforcing the definition of sex to include gender identity, to include LGBT issues. But in all reality, there was not an actual law in place that framed this concept that way. It was not until the Bostock decision that there was an affirmative grouping and organization of the definition of sex to include homosexuals or transgender individuals. And the court concluded there that an employer who fires someone for being homosexual or transgender, they are firing that person for traits or actions that would not have been questioned for members of the opposite sex. They were saying that sex there plays a necessary and an undistinguishable role in the decision. So let's break that down. And I want you to keep that Price Waterhouse thought in the back of your mind, that case that I was telling you about, right? To be homosexual, right, is for that person to be in a same-sex relationship. So let's use a male, for example, in that particular context, right? The societal expectation is that men are in relationships with women. And so if you are going to make a decision because a man is not in a relationship with a woman, they are in a relationship with a man, then that decision is based on their gender not conforming with what your perception of what their gender should conform to be. Right? Stated differently, you are making a decision based on the fact that you believe that men should be with women and not men should be with men. And long ago, back in that Price Waterhouse case that I was telling you about, the Supreme Court said that there cannot be discrimination based on someone's conformity or not conformity with, or non-conformance with the expectations of what their gender should be. When we talk about, and that's why Price Waterhouse was so really interesting and how it's been applied now, so when we're talking about that case, they often said, her employer said, we wish she would be more docile. She should be more helpful around the office. She should smile more. All of those things, right? She was not acting in conformance with what her employers thought gender should be. So really, really good and dynamic changes there. The EEOC's guidance on this topic has said that employers can't discriminate against individuals based on their sexual orientation or gender identity with respect to the terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. And that use of pronouns is something that we see in employment cases. It's usually not the main stage, but it is like a secondary act, right? I was discriminated against based on my gender, and they will list a lot of things. And one of the things may be using incorrect pronouns as I've expressed them to be there. You can't use customer preference to refuse to hire or assign work. We're not going to create or tolerate harassment in our workforces based on sexual orientation or gender identity. We're not going to require transgender employees to dress or use a bathroom in accordance with their assigned sex, or retaliate against individuals who are allies or who make complaints or who participate in this type of behavior. So I want to talk a little bit about some workplace considerations to be thoughtful about when you're thinking about pronouns and how to incorporate some very simple changes or some simple considerations for your workplace and to see how they really play out. So when we're thinking about the hiring process, it's really important to be sensitive to how people present themselves from a pronoun standpoint, how they would like to be addressed. When you think about what your actual application looks like, right? Is there an opportunity for someone to disclose their pronouns? Is there more than just Mr. or Mrs. or Miss? If there is a question for kind of the intro or salutations on there. So thinking about how that can be used in the workforce and making sure that hiring managers and recruiters are trained on how to appropriately address people by their desired pronouns. Another consideration is looking at dress code. If you are a workforce that still has a gendered dress code, that is something you really seriously need to significantly think about doing away with. And if you think about the dress codes of the 70s, 80s, or 90s, they were very, very gendered, right? It would say women should be wearing this type of heel and should have pantyhose and may need to wear skirts all the time, or their skirts need to be a particular length, and men should have these particular grooming standards. Their beards need to be certain lengths, fingernail polish, those types of things were all ascribed to what a particular gender may look like, what the expectation is. So your dress code should really reflect the type of environment that you would like to see, and not necessarily how it plays out in dress. So it should be very not related to gender. Also, when you think about workplace assignments and duties, a lot of times those can be gender related, whether it's intentional or unintentional. So being thoughtful about those assignments and duties, or those things that you would think just get done, right? So, if you are in a situation where folks are making widgets on a line, And as part of the end of the day responsibilities, people are cleaning up and taking out the trash, right? Are we only assigning those who might present as males to take out the trash, right? Is that something from a gender role standpoint we believe that men should be doing, right? Are we looking at things that may be more administrative as a female type of assignment, right? So just being thoughtful about those workplace duties and assignments and how that can impact someone's gender role and gender identity. Another thing to take a look at is review policies and procedures. I see this a lot in employee handbooks and other employee policies and procedures. A lot of them, going back to the grammar lesson, are phrased in gender specific language. So you may remember, if you have been in the workforce a while, you may remember that there was a whole thing about probably about 25 years ago. Don't worry, I was still in elementary school. I'm kidding. I was not in elementary school then, although I would like to wish that I was. There was a whole thing, right, about making sure that the default language in most official documents, policies, and procedures was he, right? And it was from this concept that there weren't women in the workforce, there weren't women around in these capacities. And so it just made natural sense. Of course, we're going to say when he takes leave or when he reports to work, whatever the case may be, because women weren't in that conversation. So you may remember that there was a desire and shift to add she to policies. So you might see he or she. When you go back to your policies, you might say just Control F and look. You might see he or she. It does not take that much to just change it to they, to make the references to gender in your policies and procedures more neutral. That is a very quick and easy inclusive step that you can do with regard to pronouns. The other considerations that you might have relate to record keeping. Private employers with 100 or more employees or federal contractors with 50 or more employees are often preparing EEO-1 reports that have to be submitted to the federal government. And those categorize your workforce on a binary gender perspective, males versus females. That is just something that is built into the process. The government is really far behind on updating these reports, but when you're thinking about pronouns, when you're thinking about gender identity and whatnot, that can have an impact on how you are keeping those records. So you want to be thoughtful about the different ways you need to maintain that information. And additionally, both the EEO-1 reports, California's pay data reporting, and affirmative, and the OFCCP with regard to affirmative action plan for my federal contractors out there, those also relate and have some different mechanisms that you can utilize to record individuals who might consider themselves in a non-binary gender capacity for reporting purposes. Other things that you might want to consider is look at your sick and medical leave policies. Are those related to gender? Oftentimes there is a thought that, from a medical leave perspective, that women are the ones taking the FMLA leave because they're having babies. The newsflash, the FMLA is not gender specific. If you have a parental leave policy or other sick leave policies, you want to just be thoughtful about whether there's a gender element to those policies. And one of the easiest things for you to do when you're looking at that, besides, working with legal counsel and whatnot, is just to think about when you take a moment, when you read your policy, who do you envision using it, right? If you can't envision someone who identifies as he, him, using a policy in the same way that someone she, her, or they, them might identify, then maybe that's something to think about how you have that policy and procedure in place. I mentioned insurance benefits and restrooms because those are something that come up in the transgender concept when we're looking at that, just in relation to how to deal with that. A lot of employers are grappling with whether they will cover transitional surgical processes and procedures in their insurance benefits, whether that's going to be covered. The kind of gold standard is to have that covered. That really shows that you are in an inclusive environment. And the restroom question has been going on for several years related to transgender individuals. And again, even from a separate pronoun standpoint, just because someone may have a different pronoun then they may physically present in a way that you identify as does not necessarily mean they may be wanting to utilize a different restroom. So what can you do? The biggest thing that I would recommend from a personal standpoint is do some self-reflection. Be aware of what you say, how you say it, and to whom you say it, right? Not everyone has the same sense of humor, life experience, or morals, but being aware of the things that you said and having some self-reflection. So here, I'll be vulnerable for a minute. I was about 10 minutes into this presentation when I realized that I had fully intended to introduce myself at the beginning with my pronouns. And I realized that on every other Zoom, for some reason, my pronouns are listed right after my name, she and her. And I realized I didn't have that here. And so from a self-reflection standpoint, I'm thinking, man, that's a missed opportunity. I could have been more inclusive. And that's something that I should have said. And of course, it makes even more sense on a webinar where I'm talking about pronouns and doing that, right? That is a moment of self-reflection where I could have done that. How many times a day do you self-reflect on things that you could have improved on, right? Aside from that, I think I'm killing it on this webinar. I think this is going really, really well. Hopefully you do too. But from a self-reflection standpoint, think about that. And not just from a pronoun standpoint, but think about how you interact with the people that you work with. Are you treating people with dignity and respect? That really is a critical piece to this. The other thing is thinking about changing your personal approach to things. Collect relevant information so that you are aware of different things. This is a really critical step, is attending a webinar, getting educated on these topics, figuring out the things that are actual facts from your opinions, theories, and suppositions. So that again requires some self-reflection. Just because there is something that you think, that does not actually mean it is a fact, right? So taking the time to kind of parse through those things and making sure that you are making judgment calls and decisions based on the facts that you have. And it's okay, and it's highly encouraged for you to periodically refine your judgment based on the new facts that you might get, right? What that means is maybe you learn something new and different on this webinar, and you're like, oh, that's a totally different way that I could have used to be thoughtful about this situation, or I could approach this situation. So I can change my judgment based on these new facts and information that I have learned. Also, try to continue to expand your opinion about people's potential. Oftentimes, we will hit a roadblock in our belief about people when we don't understand. When we get to that does not compute, I can't figure this out, right? We stop seeing their potential. Someone's pronouns being different than what you would expect them to be does not mean that they are any less of a person, does not mean that they are any less qualified, does not mean that they can't come into your organization and be a rock star like you need it and like you would want them to be. So make sure that you are expanding your opinion about certain topics beyond a person's potential, right? We went through these. So the other things are, again, I just want to keep hammering down and coming back to this, is respect others and be respected. Be respected. Think about whether your commentary is something that's offensive. Be okay with calling people out if they have conduct or behavior that's not appropriate. You don't always understand how you can impact someone, and you don't ever want to be the person that hurts people or impacts them in a negative way. So Here's some best practices and thoughts. Have some awareness about this, right? And here's where we're going to talk a little bit, end on a little bit of the legal things I want you to consider and be aware of, right? There are a lot of, aside from federal, most states have their own non-discrimination laws. So make sure you're aware of what those look like in your workforce. Make sure you're complying with them. Make sure you're applying a consistent approach. As an employment lawyer, my favorite thing is hearing consistency, telling me that you do things the same way. Actually, this is my second favorite thing. My first favorite thing is the next one, documentation. And I just note that I always have documentation of everything, but just as a side note, if you have individuals who are transitioning or identify as being transgender, you do not require medical documentation or some other type of proof of that. But treating people consistently and with dignity and respect is really, really important. You also want to make sure that you are alert and aware to bullying and other unprofessional conduct and discipline that as it's necessary. Oftentimes, a lot of things that kind of grow into being harassing or discriminatory can start from just being bullying and people having unprofessional conduct. So definitely make sure you're nipping that in the bud. Educate yourselves. Make sure you take the time to train employees on appropriate workplace behavior. Bring in an outside trainer. I do a ton of trainings all the time. Tons of other people do. There's lots of entities. Bring in trainers and make sure if there's something that you need to do to accommodate individuals where possible, that you can do that. So again, some final recommendations for you. And I don't see, well, I was looking at the chat, but I didn't see any Q&As, but
I have some questions that were submitted to me.
Okay, perfect. So I will run through these really quick. So consider training for folks, as I said. Make sure you're always constantly aware of what the legal landscape is. Discuss definitions and pronouns in a positive way. Really make sure that you are leading by example. Having those folks from outside your organization can also be helpful too. Make sure that the appropriate people are involved to begin the discussion process. Make sure that there's critical stakeholders and leaders when you are tackling these topics in your workforce. And again, treat people with dignity and respect. Be vigilant and observant of your employees. And now we'll go into some questions. So I can't wait to hear what you have for me, Amy. And I'm going to move you so I can be looking at you.
Okay, awesome. Well, you did kill it, Sheila. I think you did a fantastic job. And I took your advice and I already changed my name to put she, her in it. Because like, why not? You know? Yeah. Okay, we have a couple of questions. I guess I want to ask mine real quick. I was at a coffee shop the other day and I wasn't sure, the person that was serving me my coffee, I wasn't sure what their pronouns were. Because like it was obvious that they were dressing like, you know what I mean? Like I was questioning it. And I thought to myself, I want to ask their pronouns because I don't know them. And I don't want to be assumptive, but then the thought crossed in my mind too, like, could it be perceived as offensive that I'm asking?
So that is such I was actually talking about this in the break room with folks before I got on this webinar about, kind of the lines there. And in that situation, if it's not someone that you know and you're kind of casually interacting, you might just ask them what their name is, right? You may not even directly go to their pronoun. You might just ask them what their name is if they feel comfortable and want to share it. But in some situations, right, you might say, oh, I want to know your pronouns. I want to show you that I'm an ally. I want to show you that I'm okay with this. We have this desire and hope. And in those situations, sometimes you got to kind of feel it out, but it can be, if you are in a very public environment, you're like, hey, what's your pronouns? Because I can't tell, right? We're not going to use that type of thing. We're going to have a little bit of discretion in home training. But if you're in a situation, I think one of the best things you can do is just ask someone what their name is. And going forward, if you find yourself struggling with someone's pronoun, just call them by their name.
Great point. That is a wonderful point. Okay, so somebody else asked, if somebody changes their pronouns or comes out with a different identity after they've already been working with the company for some time, what's the best way to handle that communication? Like, I guess, what is the employer responsible for communicating with other employees or
So one of the best things that I would tell you to do is if you have employees who are transitioning, because where I want to do them in two separate things, right? Having a separate pronoun does not necessarily mean you're transitioning. So if you have someone that is transitioning into a different gender in the workplace, you want to have a collaborative discussion with them to see what their approach may be, right? They may want to only go by a different name. They may want everyone to know. They may want to be the person that does the introduction and whatnot themselves. So you want to make sure that you are working collaboratively with them. Let them know that you are there for them. Let them know that if they encounter issues, that they have, a good reporting structure. And then on your side, from an employer standpoint, you want to make sure you're documenting these things, right? That we spoke on this date and we discussed that there, is an upcoming transition in the workplace. Bailey would like to go forth and be known as Ben. And we've discussed with Ben that they would like us to let their team know during a huddle, or Ben would like to tell them during the huddle. Obviously you're going to have to feel that out for what makes sense for the environment. And, we're not going to, like, if someone's like, I'd like to throw a big old party with like announcing my whole thing, that's going to be disruptive. We're probably not going to do that, right? But usually talking through those different things can be helpful. With pronouns, if you have that in a situation, it may be a good opportunity to roll out a pronoun campaign at your business, right? So we even did this. I've seen this with employers of just starting to talk about pronouns, or even doing something as simple as putting it in a Zoom. I've had so many questions of people, when I first put my pronouns in like my webinar things in my Zoom, what does that mean? Why do you have she, her there? And that really opens a dialogue and lets people feel comfortable in that environment that's there.
conversation started, which is always a good thing.
Absolutely.
The last question that I have here is, if you witness an employee being misgendered by a customer or a client, and they don't do any, the employee doesn't do anything to stop it, what's the best way to approach that?
So that's very unique, and it's going to vary depending on the circumstances, right? So one of the things that I might do is if it's appropriate in the moment, given the situation, then you might address it there. That may be also something that you talk to the employee about when we're having this discussion. How do you want that to be handled? Would you like it if we addressed it in the moment? You may also, if the employee has, not addressed it, then just do a check-in, just do a seek to understand. Hey, I understand this happened today. I just wanted to check in and see, is there anything else that I could have done differently to support you in that situation? How would you like us to kind of handle this going forward, so that we're in a better situation for that? Maybe it's having a name tag, and maybe all the name tags have the pronouns, whatever the different situations can be for your workforce. But I think that's a really good opportunity to have a connection and conversation there.
I would feel very supported if my employer came up to me and said that, just a quick check-in, or wanted my input on, how we handle that in the future. Kimberly has one question in the Q&A box. It says, on the pronoun campaign, what happens when you have an employee who is switching their pronouns but isn't ready to announce it widely?
I think with that regard, you've got to kind of take it one day at a time. If they aren't ready to announce it widely, then go with whatever they want to. They may not even want to announce a pronoun at that time. One of the things, if it helps you think about this, think about when you have someone in your workforce that gets married and their name changes, right? We don't typically blink about that. We have little hiccups, right? Where we might call the person the wrong name or we send it to the wrong email address. But in general, we kind of accept that because that's a societal expectation that if a woman is getting married, her last name is likely changed. Or, if you're down here in the South where I am, if the girl's going to like hyphenate her name, it's like, oh my gosh, like, what are we doing? All of those. Oh, you're keeping your own name. Oh my goodness. Clutch the pearls kind of thing. I'm joking. The South's not all like that, but there are definitely pockets of that, right? We accept that as normal, right? We accept that as okay, but how are we just going to process through that? Right? If a person has, is thinking about getting married and they're not sure what name they're going to share yet, we give them the time and space to do that. Same thing here. We give folks the time and space to do that. And we also recognize that it can be something that changes. So having the ability to do that, building maybe even in your HRIS system, if there's like a self-service portal, having the ability for employees to update that information on their own with whatever frequency they like, that also provides you with an inclusive nature and also kind of gives you kind of an update on where they are.
Yeah. Great information. I learned so much. And like, I think I like to think that I'm kind of like up to date on these sort of things, but it's everything is changing a lot. And these are new ideas for a lot of people. So I just really appreciate you coming on to give us this insight. And, I said it in the chat and Sheila mentioned it too, but I'm just really impressed with the people that have come today that are willing to learn and adapt to these new ideas, because your employees, you tell your employees so much with just these sorts of things. So thank you, Sheila. Thank you everybody for coming. And we will see you all soon. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.